can't tell you all enough how privileged I feel to be here with you all today, but I say that every day about coming to work at this great institution. My name is Dr. Marquisha Frost, and I serve as the AVP for Inclusive Excellence and Mission Integration here at the University of La Verne. And while I'm only on month 3 officially in my role, I served here as an adjunct for some time between 2015 and 2020, so to be back is truly a joy and a pleasure. I want to welcome you all to today's Kristallnacht Lecture. This annual lecture honors tragic events of Kristallnacht in 1938, which marked the beginning of the Holocaust. Kristallnacht, also known as Night of Broken Glass, in 1938 was a violent riot against Jews carried out by the Nazi Party's paramilitary forces. Some from the Hitler Youth and German civilians also participated as German authorities looked on without intervening. The event was named for the shards of broken glass that littered the streets after windows of synagogues and Jewish-owned stores were smashed. This lecture is part of the Jewish Federation of Greater San Gabriel and Pomona Valley's Jewish Book Festival. We truly are honored to have you all here, and we are grateful for your presence as we remember the past, honor its victims, and reaffirm our commitment to combating hatred in all of its forms. Before we transition, and I have the pleasure of introducing the president, Dr. Risa E. Dixon, I want to just take care of a few housekeeping items. So if you have questions about the book, events, or anything else, look for those with the blue lanyards on. They are here from the Jewish Federation and are happy to assist you. The exits are located to my immediate left and to the back of this room if for some reason you need to access them. There are also restrooms down the hall and to the right. You can't miss it if you checked in. We hope you all did. There will be a reception that follows after the lecture, and you can enjoy food and fellowship at that time, in addition to a book signing. So, without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Risa E. Dixon, who is the president of the University of La Verne. With nearly 40 years in higher education, Dr. Dixon brings deep expertise in academic strategy, student success, and inclusive leadership. Her career spans roles from department chair to chief academic officer at institutions including the University of Toledo, Palo Alto University, and the University of Hawaii System. She joined La Verne as interim provost in 2024 and previously spent 24 years at Cal State San Bernardino. She is a champion for first-generation students and a recognized leader in strategic planning. Please join me in extending a warm and enthusiastic welcome to Dr. Risa E. Dixon.
Thank you, Marquisha. I love this woman. She's got such an energy about her, and it's wonderful to have her back. I want to thank, can you all hear me? I'm tall, and so my microphones are off and off. I want to thank all of you who are here today. It's really important to come together for events such as this. I want to thank members of the executive cabinet who are here, the provost, the vice president for advancement. I don't know if I see any others. Faculty, staff, students, those of you from the Jewish Federation and from the community. I appreciate that you're here. This event on our campus exemplifies 3 of the core values of our institution: the core value of diversity and inclusivity, the core value of lifelong learning, and the core value of community and civic engagement. In the Jewish tradition, memory is a key element of our identity. The Torah, or the Old Testament, reminds us almost 200 times through the word zachor, to remember. Memory is key and essential to the identity of Jews. Remembering links the generations together, whether it's the struggles, the times that we've prevailed, or the things that really need to be thought through in terms of how to deal with them later. We've all heard that those of us who forget history are doomed to repeat it. And we do forget. We forget things like the Armenian genocide, what happened in Rwanda, and other really horrible, tragic events that are harbingers of things to come. So I think it's really important that we come together to honor and remember events like these in terms of the continuity of human history, what they what led to them and what they mean for the future unless we intervene to change them. So I'm thrilled that you're all here, and I'm very, very happy to host this on our campus. With that, I would like to introduce John Carlton, who serves as the CFO for the Board of the Jewish Federation, and I believe the past president. He joined the Federation's Board of Governors in 2015, and he's a longtime member of the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. He had a long and well-regarded career as a lawyer, both locally and at the federal level, and his community service accomplishments have been just as impressive. He's got a long list of things here. Would you like me to continue? I know when people start reading things that I've done, I'm like, okay, that's history, it's important, but we've just honored it, right? He's also, in his spare time, he writes music, sings in the Federation's Kol Ha'emek community choir, which means he's also creative, I love that, and is part of the Players of the Community Theater Ensemble. So I would like to welcome John to the podium.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dixon. And thanks to all of you for supporting today's event. This is the 15th year that we have partnered with the University of Laverne for this Kristallnacht commemoration. And it was 87 years ago on this date, the evening of November 9th, 1938, that the history of the Jewish world was forever changed. German Jews throughout that country witnessed and suffered Nazi atrocities, including murders, beatings, mass arrests, destruction of synagogues, so many other things. It was Kristallnacht that many consider was the start of what later came to be known as the Holocaust. And more recently, we have been forcefully reminded that anti-Semitism, which was the root of the Holocaust, is not simply a thing of the past. I would like you to join me now for a moment of silence to honor the victims of Kristallnacht. Thank you. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Jewish Federation. We represent the Jewish community in a very large region, which stretches from Glendale to Rancho Cucamonga, south to Whittier. And we're very fortunate that the University of Laverne is right in the center of that, a perfect place for an event such as this. Our mission is to strengthen and enhance Jewish life in our region. We do that through a host of programs and services, and more recently in partnering with other federations, including the Los Angeles Federation, in a program to promote and enhance security to deal with the issues that face us all recently. Now, one of our major programs is the annual Jewish Book Festival, of which this is a part. This is its 27th year. Each year, the Book Festival strives to bring a wide array of authors to the community, and it uses multiple venues throughout our valleys to do that. The festival would not be possible without the loyal and hardworking members of the Jewish Book Festival Committee. And I have to say that these very dedicated volunteers work for 9 months to pull this event together each year. Also critical to the success of the book festival is the financial support of our literary circle and community partners, such as the University of Laverne. So thank you, everyone who helps to make this event happen year after year for now 27 years. And a special thank you to Rebecca Russell, who's not here tonight, I believe, she's the Jewish Federation's Program and Community Outreach Coordinator, who is really responsible for putting this together with the committee. A couple events that are upcoming that I'd like you to be aware of. Saturday, November 15th, author Jane Eisner will be presenting her book, Carole King, at Temple Beth Israel in Pomona. And the very next day, on the 16th, author Alka Joshi will present her book, 6 Days in Bombay, at Temple Ami Shalom in West Covina. Both of these books and the book that Mr. Goodman will be discussing tonight are on sale with others at the back. So it is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's author, Matthew Goodman. Mr. Goodman is a New York Times best-selling nonfiction author of this and 4 previous books, including The City Game, Triumph, Scandal, and a Legendary Basketball Team, which won the New York City Book Award and was a finalist for the 2019 National Jewish Book Award. Now, although he primarily writes about history, I note that among his other books is Jewish Food, The World at Table. So he is a true Renaissance man. He also teaches nonfiction writing at conferences, including the Antioch Writers Workshop, the Cape Cod Writers Conference, and the Chautauqua Institution. He has given book talks at venues throughout the country, and his articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Review, and Bon Appetit. So this afternoon, Mr. Goodman will be talking about his newest book, Paris Undercover, a wartime story of courage, friendship, and betrayal. Please welcome Matthew Goodman.
Okay. There are 3 mics, so I have to figure this out. Turn this off. Okay. While we're waiting, let me just say before anything else. Oh. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. I don't know if you can. Yeah? Okay. I'm honored to be here. I really am. This has been a dangerous trip for me and indirectly for my family. The reason being, I called my wife last night. I said, I want to move here. So she was up for it. Although her first question was, are you near the ocean? And I said, I don't think they're that near the ocean. But this is the 3rd book that I've done with the Jewish Festival. And I've been to many, many cities doing these talks. And this is the first time that I've ever felt that I actually wanted to move to the place where I was giving the talk. So this is a very special place. And I want to thank Taina and John and Rebecca, all the good people of the Jewish Federation and of this beautiful university, which is to have a university that contains on its campus a lemon tree and a lime tree is beyond imagination. And thank you all for coming tonight and helping us to honor this important day in history. I won't talk for too long. I'm not a huge fan of long lectures, but I'll talk for a while, and then I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have, and then I'm happy to sign any books. Not any books, my book in particular. I'll sign any other book, but and then I make my pilgrimage immediately afterwards to LAX. So we'll see how that goes. So this book, as John mentioned, is called Paris Undercover. It's a true story about 2 women by the names of Etta Scheiber and Kate Boniface, older women, who, let me just say, when I say older women, when I first discovered them, they were regularly being referred to in the papers as elderly women, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, elderly women. They were 59 and 62 at the time, so I resented that immediately, but in 1940, they were living in Paris. Etta was an American, Kate was an English woman, but they were living together in Paris. And in 1940, when the Germans occupied Paris, these two women set up an escape line. These two very unlikely women set up an escape line that transported many Allied servicemen out of occupied France to freedom. Well, I had never heard of these women. I had never heard of Etta Schreiber until about 6 years ago, when I was kind of trolling around looking for my next book topic, which is always the most harrowing part of the process, for me anyway. It takes a long time. But maybe about a year into that process, I encountered an article that was in Smithsonian Magazine about this older woman from New York City who had gone to Paris to live with her friend Kate, who had separated from her husband, and Etta's husband sadly had died, and so she was a widow. And Kate had this big apartment in the 16th arrondissement in Paris that was too big for her, if you could imagine such a thing, to have an apartment too big in Paris. And she invited Etta to come stay with her. And this was all laid out in this article, and then the various escapades and endeavors that they undertook. And I was stunned by this because I had never heard of these two women, much less what they had done. And then it turned out that Etta, upon her return to the United States in 1942, when she was, I'm getting ahead of myself, but when she was returned to the United States in 1942, she then wrote a memoir of her experiences in France that was called Paris Underground, that became a major bestseller. It sold 500,000 copies. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 18 weeks. They made a movie out of it, a Hollywood movie. And again, I had not heard of this. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write about these two women. And in point of fact, they did turn out to be even more interesting, and the relationship between the two of them even more complicated than I had ever imagined. But what I also found out was that almost everything that was contained in that article in the Smithsonian was untrue. And I will talk more about that and my discovery of that in a moment. But I'll tell you what is true, which is that, in fact, Etta and Kate did create this escape line that ended up stretching through the entirety of France. Theirs was really the first one that went all the way from the north of France, if you know France, it's called the Pas de Calais, down to their apartment in Paris, where they sheltered these men, got them false identity cards and train tickets and so forth that they paid for out of their own pocket. And then the soldiers were shuttled to a town called Le Borgne, which was right on the line of demarcation between occupied and unoccupied France, where they were met by what was called a passer, who was a peasant, an illiterate man by the name of Elie Tessier, extraordinarily courageous, who died a tragic death in a concentration camp, who would ferry them down the Dordogne River and then walk them across into unoccupied France, where they would then take a train to Marseille, from where they could then go back to England. Or if they were French, to go to London to meet up with Charles de Gaulle, who was putting his army of resistance together in London. They did this for dozens of men who, by the way, not only did they save their lives, these men then went back into the war, right? So, in fact, in the back of this book, I have listed the names and the units of all of the men who they saved. And many of them ended up getting medals for distinguished service. for their part in subsequent action in the war. And one of them even became a general. Brigadier General Derek Lang was one of the men who had been sheltered by these two women in their home before he managed to escape occupied France. So that's the basics. That's the basic outline of what they did. Etta Schreiber was an American woman. She was from New York City. She was 62 years old when this was all going on. She had lived a remarkably sheltered life. She had not, as I discovered, she had not lived outside of a 5 square block radius on the Upper East Side for her entire life, from birth until the time when she emigrated to Paris to live with her friend Kate. I suppose if you're going to live in a 5-block radius, the Upper East Side is not a bad place to do that. But she had lived an extremely limited, certainly geographically, a limited life up to that point. She had not had a job for the entirety of her adult life. She married when she was 21 and then did not work again. Her husband was worked for William Randolph Hearst in the Hearst newspapers. And she was someone who was almost crippled by anxiety. She suffered from anxiety her whole life, at a time before they really had a lot of treatments for that. So, think about this woman, older, limited, anxious, who then goes to Paris and ultimately gets caught up in this scheme in which she's risking really her life in order to resist. I'll tell you one other thing about Etta Schreiber that nobody knew, and is not mentioned in this article, and is not mentioned in her memoir. Etta Schreiber was Jewish. Etta Schreiber was Jewish. She, as I discovered, she came from a family of Alsatian Jews. Her grandfather was the second, not the first, but the second optician in the United States, coming from Alsace. She was Jewish on both sides of her family, and yet that fact never made it into the public record. And why that is, I will talk more about in a moment. So she was a Jewish woman, a Jewish heroine, who we have never really known of before. I became interested in this, I will say, I was financially desperate to find a job, so but I was especially interested in this story because this was at the end of 2019. This was the last year of the first Trump administration. And I was fascinated by the notion of what it took to make two seemingly conventional women, two women living entirely ordinary lives, two older women who had not been active in any particular way, what it was that caused them to risk their safety and ultimately risk their lives to resist, not to put too fine a point on it, to resist fascism. And that was a question that continued to fascinate me as I was working on this book. And now, let me just say, here we are in the first year of the second Trump administration, and I think that a lot of these issues are just as relevant today, if not more so. So I began writing the book, or I began researching the book at the end of 2019, and then what happened 3 months later, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit, which meant that I could not get on a plane and go to Paris, where much of the information for this book was kept, or to London, where much of the information about this book was kept. And so I had to hire researchers, which I've never ever done before, but I had basically a whole team of researchers in Italy and France and Germany and England doing the work that I couldn't get to do. And I couldn't even get into the New York Public Library, which is my home library, on 42nd Street with the two lions out front, Patience and Fortitude. it was closed to the public for a year. And I knew that there was material inside there that I could not get to. And then after a year, there was this halcyon period of time, like about a month, when the public was still not allowed inside the library. But if you were an accredited researcher with the New York Public Library and been appropriately interviewed by a librarian there, you were allowed in to the library. And so there was this period of time where I would be sitting in the vast main reading room, the Rose Reading Room of the New York Public Library, and I was the only person in that room. And I would call my wife from the library, which you're not allowed to do, to say, I'm the only one in here. There's no one. I felt like Lord Grantham in Downton Abbey, sitting in his library with all these old books, But the thing about Etta's memoir is that it was published in 1943 while the war was going on. And as a result of that, they used pseudonyms for the names of all of the characters in the book because they didn't want to give information to the Nazis. And so I didn't know the names of any of the people in the book, including her friend Kate, who was identified in the book as Kitty Beaurepaud, not by her real name. So I had to first track down who these people actually were. And that is a difficult undertaking. And it took me a while. And then finally, I got an email, I remember it vividly, late one night from a researcher in Caen, C-A-E-N, right? But it's pronounced Caen, because in French, there are 4 letters and 3 are not pronounced. So Caen. And he had found in a military archive there, in a folder, the actual statement of charges from the Nazi military tribunal in German for Etta and Kate and their comrades, their co-defendants, that had all of their names, their real names, and their ages and their occupations. And so from there, I was able to begin to start to piece together the story. And so things proceeded along for a period of time, but there was a problem. There was a problem that I had, which is that there's a precipitating incident in Etta's memoir. This is the incident that, according to this memoir, started the escape line into motion. And it is the most famous incident in the book. The Reader's Digest excerpted a portion of the memoir, and this was the chapter that they took. This is the incident that's mentioned in all of the reviews of the book. It's clearly the big scene of the book. And what happens is that as the Nazis are coming into Paris in June 13th, 1940, as the German armies are marching in, indeed most of Paris fled. Most of the residents of Paris fled and made their way south to get away from the Nazi troops. It was actually, much of France was on the move. I think 10 million people were on the road that day. It was the largest exodus in human history up to that point. Kate and Etta were 2 of the women who were on this exodus. Kate, who was a remarkable woman in numerous ways, but one of the ways in which she was unconventional was that she owned her own car, actually had driven ambulances during the war. She owned her own car, and the 2 of them set out south to get away from the Nazis. And according to the memoir, what happened was that they stopped in this town called Orléans they have 3 Cocker Spaniels, 3 black Cocker Spaniels, to get their Cocker Spaniels some food. And they walk into this inn in Orléans to get food for their dogs. And this proprietor comes out very distraught and says to them, Mesdames, do you speak English, because there's someone here who should not be here. And it turns out that he was an RAF pilot, a downed RAF pilot by the name of William Gray, who had not been able to get out of France during the Dunkirk evacuations and had been left behind and was trapped now with the invading armies, and he was about to be captured. Well, in a burst of just sort of in an impulsive moment of empathy, according to the memoir, Etta decides, let's throw him into the trunk of our car and drive him back to our apartment, and then we'll figure out what to do with him at that point. Now, they had no idea about how one got anybody out of occupied Paris. There had never been an occupied Paris up until that day, right? And in point of fact, that was one of the methods they used. They put soldiers in the trunk of their car and transported them across the Nazi checkpoints. Kate's car was a Peugeot 420, which had a very unusual feature, which is that the trunk was not in the back of the car. It was actually underneath the rear seats of the car, so that you couldn't really see the trunk from outside. And a man could just, if he kind of scrunched himself up, could fit inside there. And one time when they were doing this, they had gotten a guy out of a military hospital in a town called Doullens, north of Paris. And they were bringing him back to their apartment in Paris, as they had done before. And all had gone well, except this time they got waved over by two Nazi officers who said, we're going to this address in the next town. Could you give us a ride there? Because there weren't many, cars on the road at that time. What could they do but to say yes? So these two Nazi officers got into the rear seat of the car with this prisoner directly below their feet. It's a true story. The man's name was Gordon Hood Cree. He wrote a personal essay about it after the war. I spoke to his widow. I spoke to his children, and they attest to this, that this happened. So they're driving along, Kate driving, Etta in the passenger seat, and the two Nazi officers in the back seat with an escaped British officer directly at their feet. Well, Etta said that she could barely speak. Her heart was just in her throat. But Kate, who was far more the cooler of the two, kept up a regular conversation with these Nazi officers so that they'd be distracted and they wouldn't hear any noises that might be coming from this metal box, this hot metal box. This is in August, hot metal box directly below their seat. And eventually they brought the Nazis to where they were going, and all was fine until they got to the outskirts of Paris, when Etta thought she heard a shot. And she said, was that a shot? And Kate said, no, it's our tire. We have a flat tire. And they get out of the car and they try to jack up the car, which they can't do because there's a 200-pound man in the back of the car. And finally what happens is he gets out of the trunk of the car and does it himself, and then gets back in, and they drive back. But he survived, and he, lived a long, good life. But in any case, this officer, go back to the inn in Orleans, William Gray, they put him in the trunk of the car, according to the memoir, and then bring him back home, and thus does their escape line go into operation. The problem that I had was that by this point, I had been able to identify the names of all of the co-defendants, all the people involved in the escape line, including memorably a French country priest by the name of Edouard Renier, who was an amazing individual. And I had identified the significant soldiers who they had transported out. But I could not find any information about this William Gray. Now, I knew that William Gray was not his real name because it was a pseudonym, but I couldn't find anyone who met anywhere close to this kind of description. And the more that I looked into the details of the case, the less likely it appeared to me that this could really have happened. There were almost no pilots who were left behind. There were a number of reasons. I couldn't figure it out. And I was thinking, how am I going to write this book, which is a nonfiction historical account of what happened, when I don't even know the identity of the one who sets it all into motion? I did not know what to do. And then what happened was that I was given a packet of letters that Etta Schreiber had written home to her brother, who lived in upstate New York, in Syracuse, in the months immediately preceding and then immediately following the Nazi occupation of Paris. She was a dedicated letter writer. And I had made contact with Etta's grandniece, who was the closest family who's still alive, and she had copies of these letters, which she mailed to me. And it made clear to me that my fear had been realized, that in fact there was no William Gray, that had not happened, that in fact Kate and Etta had not driven south to Orléans, they had driven west, and they had not returned that same night. They had stayed 3 weeks in the west of France, visiting various people, and then came back to Paris, and that in fact their escape line had begun 2 months later, and that this was all made up. And I realized that if this was made up, then this was the scene I was so thrilled about being able to write, that the next scene, which I was equally thrilled about being able to write, in which there's an unexpected search of their apartment by the Gestapo, and they have to dress up the William Gray as Etta's late brother, Irving, to convince them that he's her brother. That couldn't have happened either, because there was no William Gray. And if that didn't happen, then the next on and on and on. And I began to wonder, how much of this book really did happen? And that this book that was so good that initially I had worried my book was simply going to be a gloss on her book, in which I'm basically just saying to people, read that book. That's a really great book. Now I'm realizing is not a reliable source at all, because I don't know what's true and what's not true in that book. Well, this was a bad period for me. This was the period when I began to think, do I have to return the advance money to the publisher? I did not know what to do. And one day I was talking to a friend of mine about it, who's a writer, and I said, I have a hole in my narrative and I just don't know what to do about that. And she said, she told me that she had studied writing at New York University with E.L. Doctorow, the novelist E.L. Doctorow, whom I revere. He's one of my favorite novelists. And Doctorow had said to his class, if you have a hole in your narrative, don't run away from the hole, point to the hole. And I was struck by that, because it's so counterintuitive. Why would a writer want to alert the reader to the fact that there's a hole in your narrative? But there was something in there that seemed right to me. And eventually it began to come clear to me that, in fact, how Etta's memoir came to be written and why it came to be written in exactly the way that it was part and parcel of understanding the whole story of this escape line. And in fact, you can't really understand the relationship between Kate and Etta and why they never spoke to each other again after the war without confronting the reality of this memoir. And so that, once I realized that, the pieces began to kind of fall into place. And little by little, I began to put together what had actually happened. And what had actually happened was that Etta Schreiber did not write her memoir. She was approached after her return to the United States. I should say, by the way, that Kate and Etta's escape line only lasted about 3 months, which was very typical for escape lines of the time. The lifespans of which were measured in days and weeks or months rather than in years. A French historian wrote that this was the artisanal phase of the escape lines. You know, you were sort of inventing everything from scratch. So they were captured by the Gestapo in December, and then Kate spent the rest of the war in Nazi prison camps. She was one of the so-called night and fog prisoners that Hitler had deemed the most dangerous political prisoners. So she spent the rest of the war not in concentration camps, but in prisons that were built in castles, these old castles in Europe for political prisoners. But Etta went to prison for 18 months, at which point she was traded for a German female spy by the name of Johanna Hoffmann. So she returned to the United States in 1942, at which point she was met by a man named Paul Winkler, who had read about her in the paper. Paul Winkler was himself a Jewish refugee from Paris, of Hungarian origin. He was a remarkable man in his own right. He was a very well-known agent and promoter. He had been, as a very young man, Walt Disney's agent in Europe at the age of like 24 or something. He convinced Walt Disney to let him be that guy. And he basically convinced Etta to participate in the writing of this memoir based on her experiences. Etta was a little reticent about doing this at first because she said, you know, they're still over there. I don't want to do anything that might in some way compromise their safety. And Paul Winkler said, don't worry about that. We're going to give them pseudonyms. We're going to change around some of the details. It's going to be all fine. And you're going to get a lot of money, for this book. So Etta finally agreed, and she was interviewed for 5 months by people on Paul Winkler's staff. But Paul Winkler and his wife, whose name was Elizabeth, they didn't write the book either, as it turned out. Even on the front of the book, on the title page of the book, it says by Etta Schreiber with Paul and Anne Dupree. They were pseudonyms too, Paul and Anne Dupree. There was no Paul and Anne Dupree. Paul and Anne Dupree stood for Paul Winkler and his wife Elizabeth, but they didn't write it either. It was written, and for a period of time, I was the only person in the world who knew this. So I knew a lot about a very, very tiny piece of information. It was actually written by another Jewish refugee from Europe by the name of Alidor Farkas, who was a Hungarian Jewish refugee who was a client of Paul Winkler. And Paul Winkler gave him the interview transcripts, and he wrote this book. Now, after the book came out, and it was a huge success, and his name wasn't on it, he sued the Winklers and their publishing company, Charles Scribner's and Sons. The editor of the book, by the way, was a guy named Maxwell Perkins, who was the most famous editor in the history of American literature, who had edited Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe and so forth. He edited this book as well. Alidor Farkas sued, and I found in the archives at Princeton University, in the archives of Charles Scribner's and Sons Publishing Company, there's a folder that says Etta Schreiber on it, Etta Schreiber. And in it is the 35-page notarized affidavit written by Alidor Farkas to make his case, in which he describes in intimate detail the process by which he wrote this book, which he had intended to be a novel, not a work of nonfiction. And he was shocked when the book came out and he discovered that it was being marketed as a work of nonfiction, as a memoir. And then, in fact, it had spent 18 weeks rather, on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list. He wrote in his affidavit, and I quote him, "A fraud has been perpetrated upon the American people as a result of this publication." And as part of his affidavit, he gives an itemized list of 17 characters whom he had simply invented in the course of writing this book. Number one on the list was William Gray, the RAF pilot, and number two was the proprietor of the inn at Orleans, who hadn't existed either. So ultimately what happened was that the case was settled out of court, and he received money and he received credit on future editions of the book, but it never came out, and there was never any question about the factuality of the book until I began to research it and discovered, this. Because really what had happened was that there were a lot of war memoirs that came out in 1943. There were a lot. There was something like 50 or something. And I guess Paul Winkler had decided that, if 20 soldiers saved were good, then 200 saved were 10 times as good. And so what you see in the book, it says that we saved 150 men. In point of fact, they saved 20 English soldiers and 20 French soldiers, so 40 in all, which is a lot, and is courageous and is remarkable that they did that. It's not 150. And then when you follow the subsequent publicity for the book, it suddenly becomes 200 men were saved by them. And then in some of the reviews, it becomes more than 200 men were saved in a period of like 3 months, which is impossible that there were 200, English-speaking men of military age who were walking in and out of their apartments, in France. It's impossible. But everyone accepted it as true. So this is what happened. Now, the result of this is that in 1943, Kate Boniface, who was the brains of the operation, who was the driving force behind this operation, no one knew where she was. No one even knew if she was alive or dead, because she had been sent behind the veil of night and fog. So she couldn't receive packages, she couldn't send messages. No one knew where she was, no one knew what had happened to her. And when the book was published, no one knew what had happened. No one knew if she was alive or dead. Well, she was quite alive. She was I was going to say staying. She wasn't really staying. She was imprisoned in Yaur, which is in Lower Slovenia, in a terrible prison for political prisoners. And what happened was that this book came out and was a big success. And it was serialized in the pages of the Daily Mail in London, which was the most widely read newspaper in all of England. And the Nazis read it, and they believed everything that was in there, which they should have, because the front of the book, of the memoir, says, everything in this book is true. Okay? So the Nazis thought that they had on their hands this woman who had saved 150 men and had done these various other things, claimed for her in the book. And so what they did was they tortured her to get the information, which she could not possibly give them because she had no idea what they were talking about. None of this had happened. She had already confessed to the stuff that did happen. But now there's this other stuff. So they tortured her and they sentenced her to death as a result of the activities in the book. Fortunately, that sentence was never carried out. But you can't understand what happened next without understanding all of this. Because what happened next, and again, I was the only person who knew this until this book came out, and I discovered this on a sheet of paper that was on a folder in the National Archives and Research Administration building outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. In the archives of the State Department, United States State Department, there's a folder that says Kate Boniface. And in there is a note. And in that note, it indicates that on the very day that Kate returned to France at the end of the war, this is now in 1945, she was in horrible physical condition. She weighed 70 pounds. All of her teeth had been knocked out by in torture with keys, metal keys. She was staying in temporary housing, and she was visited by Paul Winkler's wife, Elizabeth Winkler, who brought her a copy of this successful book, which was dedicated to her. And she read that book, clearly had read it in one night, because the very next day, she went to the British Embassy in Paris to inquire about the possibility of suing her friend, Etta Schreiber, for the damage that had been done to her and to the danger that she was placing her comrades in. They told her, you're not going to win that case, it's very complicated, don't do it. But she never spoke to Etta again. Etta only lived another 3 years after the war, and they were both in terrible physical shape. They never spoke to each other again. But Kate was a remarkable woman who did remarkable things, and she survived to almost 80. And I spoke to her 2 sons who were very happy to talk about their heroic mother. So I'm going to end there with this, except to say that again, I was so struck in writing this book by the courage displayed by these 2 women, one of whom was Jewish, acting under the noses of the Nazis to save men who were fighting against the Nazis. And these 2 women who took it upon themselves to do what needed to be done to resist the tide of encroaching social injustice and scapegoating of a vulnerable sector of this society. And as I said, I think that is a question that we all face today. It's not a case that it was only in 1940. It's something we all face today as well. So with that, I will stop and I will take any questions that anybody might have. If you have, thank you.